I can still hear the soft squeak of my sneakers against the marble floors, the bitter scent of bleach rising with every stroke of my mop. Above me, their voices floated, light, careless, like I wasn't even there. "She's just the housekeeper," one of them whispered, like a secret meant to sting. I kept my head down. That was the rule. Invisible hands, invisible dreams. The chandeliers above scattered cold light across the room, catching on the gold buttons of their coats, the gleam of their jewelry, the polished tips of their shoes. I worked while they laughed, their words slicing through me softer than knives, but deeper somehow, assuming I had nothing to say, nothing to be. At first, the shame sat heavy inside me, like wet laundry clinging to skin. I swallowed it whole, tucking it into the corners of my heart where no one would see. But shame has a strange alchemy. In the quiet, in the loneliness, it began to change. It thickened into a slow, stubborn ember, a small fire that no amount of cold glances could smother. They thought I was just a housekeeper. They had no idea. I was already building an empire. The first day I stepped into that grand estate, I carried everything I owned in a cracked suitcase with a broken zipper. The woman at the front desk barely glanced at me before handing over the uniform. Navy blue, 2 sizes too big, stiff with starch. "You'll be working mornings and evenings," she said without meeting my eyes. "Keep out of sight when guests arrive." I nodded, biting the inside of my cheek so I wouldn't cry. Pride doesn't feed you, I reminded myself. Pride doesn't pay rent. I needed this job. At the time, I told myself it was temporary, just until I got back on my feet. A few months, maybe. A year at most. But life has a way of settling into your bones when you aren't looking. Days blurred into weeks. Weeks hardened into months. I became part of the furniture. A quiet shadow moving through hallways, straightening pillows, scrubbing away other people's footprints. And yet, no matter how low I bowed my head, shame clung to me. It wasn't the work, and no, honest work never shamed me. It was the way they looked through me, as if my dreams had no weight, my existence no meaning beyond their comfort. There were nights I stood at the bus stop, hands raw from bleach, coat too thin for the winter wind, wondering if maybe they were right. Maybe I was small. Maybe I was forgettable. But inside, a voice, soft, stubborn, whispered otherwise. "You are not what they see. You are what you build." It wasn't anger that kept me going. It was something quieter, a slow, aching hunger. Not for revenge, but for dignity. For a life where I wouldn't have to shrink to fit someone else's narrow gaze. That's when the idea first came to me. Small, fragile, but alive. If they would never open the doors for me, maybe it was time I built my own. The hardest part wasn't the hours. I was used to hard work, the kind that left your hands cracked and your knees aching. No, the hardest part was believing I had any right to dream beyond it. After my evening shifts, when the house had fallen into a deep, velvet silence, I would slip into the tiny back room they gave us, the one with the flickering overhead light and the secondhand mattress that sagged in the middle. There, tucked under the thin blanket, I cracked open old business textbooks I'd scavenged from a library sale, battered, yellowed pages filled with words like equities, projections, and client relations. At first it felt laughable, a housekeeper studying how to run a company, but every night I pushed through the weariness, slowly, painfully. I taught myself, one chapter, one unfamiliar word at a time. I saved every penny I could. I cut out takeout meals, new clothes, bus rides when I could walk. I mended my shoes with thread from an old sewing kit. It wasn't about getting rich. It wasn't even about pride anymore. It was about building something that couldn't be taken from me, something that would stand even if no one applauded. During the day, I wiped fingerprints from glass and polished brass fixtures until they gleamed like mirrors. At night, I imagined a different reflection, one where I wasn't someone else's background scenery, but the architect of my own life. It was a lonely road. No one cheered, no one noticed, but somewhere between the scent of ammonia and the turning pages of those tattered books, a foundation was quietly being laid, deeper and stronger than the marble floors I scrubbed. And I held onto that thought like a talisman. One day, they wouldn't just see me. They would stand on something I built with these tired, stubborn hands. It started small. So small, it barely felt real. One of the residents, a kind older woman named Mrs. Latham, had noticed how carefully I tended her rooms. One afternoon, as I fluffed the cushions and dusted the windowsills, she asked almost shyly, "Would you ever consider cleaning my daughter's apartment? She's just had surgery, and you have such a gentle touch." I hesitated, fear tangled with hope in my chest, but the words came out steadier than I felt. "I'd be honored, ma'am." That first job outside the estate was like planting a single seed in barren soil. I spent 2 hours scrubbing, organizing, polishing, pouring every ounce of care into that little apartment as if it were a palace. Word spread, not fast, but steady. One neighbor told another. Within 6 months, I was working 6 days a week, mornings at the estate, afternoons cleaning private homes across the city. I never advertised, no flashy business cards, no online listings, just whispered recommendations, passed from one satisfied heart to another. At night, I recorded every dollar in a battered notebook, its pages smudged with soap-stained fingertips. Slowly, the numbers grew. I opened a humble savings account, the kind with no minimum deposit, and watched with wide, disbelieving eyes as my balance crept from double digits to triple. It wasn't an empire yet. It was a handful of dust and dreams. Fragile, vulnerable. But for the first time, when I looked in the mirror after scrubbing the last sink and folding the last towel, I didn't just see a tired housekeeper. I saw a builder, a quiet architect, laying one invisible brick at a time. And no one could take that away from me. The offer came on a damp Thursday afternoon. A small commercial office downtown needed regular cleaning. 5 floors, twice a week. It would be my first real contract, the kind that could finally let me leave the estate for good. I was terrified, but I was ready. I spent 3 nights drafting the proposal by hand, poring over sample templates, calculating every supply cost, every hour. When I handed it in, a plain manila folder with my trembling signature, the manager smiled warmly. "We'll be in touch soon," she said. I floated home that night, lighter than air, already imagining my future with a tiny office, a van with my name on it, maybe even a second employee. But 2 days later, I got the call. "We've decided to go with another service," the manager said, polite but distant. "Thank you for your time." At first, I thought it was just competition. That's business, right? You win some, you lose some. But the next week, back at the estate, I overheard something that knocked the breath from my lungs. One of the senior housekeepers, a woman I had once trusted, laughed as she told another, "Poor thing, she really thought she could run a company. I told my cousin who owns a cleaning crew about the job, figured it should go to someone who knows what they're doing." Her voice was light, almost amused, like it was all a harmless joke. I stood there, hidden behind a heavy velvet curtain, the polish rag limp in my hand. It wasn't just betrayal, it was confirmation. In their eyes, I would always be nothing more than the help. The sting of it ran deeper than I cared to admit. It made me want to crumble, to walk away from the dream altogether. For a long moment, I leaned against that cold marble wall, feeling the weight of all my invisible years pressing down. Maybe they were right. Maybe I was foolish to believe I could be more. But somewhere inside the bruised silence, a fiercer voice stirred. Low, steady, and full of quiet rage. "Let them laugh. You'll build it anyway." That night, I sat on the edge of my sagging mattress, the rejection letter crumpled in my hand. The bare bulb above me swung slightly in the drafty air, casting long, shivering shadows across the room. I stared down at the letter, cold, final. And for the first time in a long while, the weight of it all broke through. I cried. Not the dignified tears you wipe away with the back of your hand, the kind that heave up from somewhere so deep, so buried, you almost forget they belong to you. I cried for every invisible hour I had worked, for every polite smile that hid a condescending glance, for every dream I dared to water, only to see it stomped into the dirt. Part of me wanted to let go, to give up the foolishness, accept my place, and stop fighting an invisible war. Wouldn't it be easier to settle into what they believed about me, to make peace with the smallness they handed me, like scraps tossed to a stray dog? But even in that brokenness, something inside refused to bend, not out of pride, not even out of anger anymore. It was something quieter, something older, a knowing, a remembrance, that I had never been small, not really. I had only been unseen. I folded the rejection letter carefully, smoothing the wrinkles with my palm, and tucked it into the bottom drawer of my nightstand, right next to my growing stack of old business textbooks. A reminder, not of failure, but of choice. I could surrender to the way they saw me, or I could build something so steady, so rooted that no whisper, no betrayal, no storm could tear it down. I wiped my eyes with the hem of my sleeve, stood up slowly, and turned off the light. Tomorrow, I decided, the work would begin again. Only this time I would be building for me, and no one else. The next morning, the world looked the same. Gray sidewalks, shivering trees, the breath of winter clinging to every window pane. But something inside me had shifted. I moved through the estate halls with the same steady steps, but I no longer clung to their approval like a child grasping for a mother's hand. I didn't need it, not anymore. Instead of chasing contracts from places that didn't see me, I turned to the people who already trusted my hands. The elderly, the new mothers, the small business owners who needed someone who treated their space like their own. One by one, they came. Not in a rush. No, real things grow slow. But each job was a brick, each thank you note, a beam of quiet strength. I hired my first helper, Maria, a woman with eyes full of kindness and a laugh that warmed even the coldest winter morning. Then another, and another. We didn't have a shiny office, just a rusted old van and hearts full of stubborn dignity. I saved every extra penny, not to flaunt, not to boast, but to build with. A website made by a local college student, matching uniforms stitched with our simple logo, a single open hand, palm facing up, an offering, a promise. 3 years later, when I finally signed the lease for our own small office space, tucked between a bakery and a secondhand bookstore, I stood outside the door for a long moment, keys trembling in my hand. No crowd waited, no trumpets blared, just the steady hum of life moving all around me. The low chatter of the bakery owner sweeping his sidewalk, the scent of fresh bread curling into the cold morning air. I smiled to myself, a deep, private smile. They still saw a housekeeper maybe, but I knew better now. I had built something, not in spite of them, but because of what they could never see. Sometimes when I pass by the old estate on my way to a client meeting, I slow down. The grand marble steps are still there, gleaming under the midday sun. The heavy brass doors still polished to a mirror shine. The laughter still floats out of open windows, light and careless. But it no longer pierces me. I see it for what it always was, a beautiful cage I was never meant to stay in. The real empire wasn't marble or gold. It wasn't chandeliers or silk drapes. It was built in the quiet hours, in every small, stubborn choice to believe in myself when no one else did. In every moment I wiped tears from my face, straightened my shoulders, and kept going. It's funny. The world still divides people into seen and unseen, still decides who belongs where, based on old, tired rules. But I learned something they never could teach me. The most powerful things grow in silence. The strongest roots burrow deep underground, invisible but unstoppable. I never needed to storm their gates. I just needed to plant my own seeds, tend my own soil, water my own dreams. And in time, what I built stretched far beyond anything they could ever contain. Some days I still scrub a countertop or sweep a floor, but now I do it on my own terms. As the founder of a company built with my own two hands, steady and sure. And when I catch my reflection in a storefront window, hair tucked back, clipboard in hand, a quiet fire in my chest, I don't see the help anymore. I see the empire, alive, rooted, mine. If you've ever been told that your dreams are too big for your place in the world, I want you to hear this. You are not invisible. The world might not see you at first. It might not recognize your quiet strength or the work you put into what others dismiss. But keep going. Build in silence. Stay steady, even when the road feels long and the rewards are unseen. Because what you create in those quiet moments, the ones no one is watching, has a way of standing firm when everything else falls apart. And one day, when the world looks around, it will see the empire you've built, not out of pride, but out of quiet dignity. So don't let anyone define your worth. Keep building. Keep dreaming. Your empire is waiting. As I sit here now, reflecting on everything I've built, I realize something I never quite understood before. The invisible ones are not lacking in worth. They are the ones who carry flames no one dares to look at, burning brightly in the dark, casting warmth in places where light is scarce. It's easy for society to overlook them, to call them small, insignificant, to write them off as shadows in the corners of a world that values wealth, power, and noise. But in their quiet persistence, in the dignity they carry with each humble step, they are the true architects of change. I see now that every housekeeper, every janitor, every person ever told they don't matter, they are planting seeds. Quietly, steadily, they're creating a world where dignity is not something to be fought for, but something that belongs to all, regardless of where they stand or how much they have. This journey of mine, this quiet rebellion against being unseen, is not just my own. It is the story of anyone who has been told they are less than. It is the shared strength of those who stand in the shadows, refusing to let the darkness define them. Because what's built in silence, what's built from love for something beyond the self, that cannot be erased. In the end, the world is shaped not by the loudest voices, but by the quiet ones who never stop, never bend, and never forget that their worth is not determined by anyone else's gaze.